Good afternoon. My name is Ulf Sverdrup. It's a pleasure to welcome you here to this NUPI seminar. I should warn you that this seminar will also be streamed. Now, today we have not a very big crowd, but I'm very glad to see that we have an excellent crowd among the people who actually are influential in shaping and designing Norway's relationship to the EU, also in the field of foreign and security policy. We also have an excellent speaker, Christophe Hillon, Professor Christophe Hillon. He's a professor now at the University of Oslo and at the University of Leiden. He's also a professor at NUPI, so he works part-time at NUPI. We're really glad for that because he's very skillful on Europe, and he brings in the legal dimension also in our studies of Europe, and that's something that we all appreciate very much. Now, as you know, the topic of this seminar, first of all, I should say, it's rooted in a project that was generously funded by the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, so thanks for that funding and support. And the initial idea was that after Brexit and the UK wanted to leave the EU, Theresa May said that she wanted to have a comprehensive security arrangement with the EU following Brexit. She even said in her Florence speech she wanted to have a security treaty covering justice and home affairs and also traditional foreign security policy, defense policy. At the time when this project started, this was supposed to pick up on that idea. Look into what would the EU and the UK, what could they agree upon, and how and to what extent would that be relevant for Norway. As we have worked with this project, I think we have modified things slightly. We have moved the project into looking into what, based upon what we have learned throughout the Brexit negotiations and the reinterpretations of the legal principles and development within the EU law, what is it reasonable to expect from the EU? And what can the EU give and offer to other third countries, be it Brexit or UK, be it Norway and other things, in the field of foreign security and defense policy? So that's the reformulated version of this project. So it's about what can, based on EU law, EU policies, EU negotiation positions, offer. And what are the possibilities and what are the limitations as we see them from a legal point of view, but also from a political point of view. And Christophe will make an introductory remark for around 35 plus minus some minutes, and then we open up for a conversation and discussion on some of these topics. He has already warned me that he will not provide the political solution for Norway, what Norway should do. But I think it's a nice opportunity to use this seminar to have a bit of a reflection, not only Q&A, but also a reflection and discussion about what Norway should do, because there are some possibilities this opened up throughout this process and as a consequence of Christophe's study. Now, let me just, I guess most of you know this already, but Norway's agreements with the EU is not only the EEA, but we have 80 different agreements or something with the EU. And we have already quite extensive cooperation in the field of justice, now in the field of foreign and security and defense policy with the EU. But a lot of this is taking part outside of the EEA agreement. And that means that there's no comprehensive unified legal structure or institutional structure accommodating this cooperation, and there's no mechanisms in place for securing some kind of dynamic updating of these agreements as we have in the field of economic relations through the EEA agreement. So that's one point that you should be aware of. The second point is, of course, that as you're all aware of, there's considerable developments in the field of foreign security and defense policy in the EU. Ambitions have been lifted, so a much higher ambitions for what they want to achieve, and this is partly due to the dynamics within the EU legal system, where the new treaties kind of give competences to the EU in these fields to some extent. Okay, Christophe will expand on this. But also the changing geopolitical situation that drives some kind of call for a more stronger role for the EU, and some even advocate some kind of notion of a strategic autonomy for the EU. Maybe I said too much, Christophe. It's a pleasure to welcome you.
Then we open the debate, you know.
Okay, we work together on this project. So, Christophe, please.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much. Does it work?
Yep.
Yes? Good. Thanks very much, Ulf. Indeed, you did a brilliant work in introducing my own introduction. So I'll begin indeed with a few preliminary remarks to map out a little bit the background to this particular research before saying a few things about the report, the methodology that has been used, as well as the key observations that came about while undergoing the analysis. And then I will venture, but strictly from a legal point of view, I will venture in flagging up 4 scenarios which could structure the way in which Norway would possibly develop its cooperation with the EU in the field of CFSP, the Common Foreign and Security Policy, which, as you know, includes the Common Defence and Security Policy. So it's been said already, I should put a timer. Yes, but you know, the French minutes are slightly longer. So it's been pointed out already that Norway has cooperated quite a lot with the EU in the field of foreign policy, security and defence over the years, actually for decades. And such cooperation has developed, as was pointed out by Ulf, alongside the other frameworks which structure the current Norway's relationship with the EU, namely mainly the agreement on the European Economic Area, the EEA, but also other frameworks such as the Schengen Association Arrangements and various other arrangements which cover relations such as free movement of judgment of civilian and commercial courts. So a wide variety of agreements, and the CFSP somehow has been addressed in a different way on the basis of several different more sectoral arrangements. Indeed, as the CFSP of the EU has developed and has widened, so have the arrangement which Norway has established with the EU. So just to recall a couple of examples, one would be Norway's participation in several EU civilian and military missions, the cooperation between Norway and the European Defence Agency, the alignment, quite regular alignment of Norway with EU foreign policy positions, but also restrictive measures, the so-called sanctions, which, as you may have noticed, have multiplied over the last years to become essentially a core instrument of EU foreign policy. And last but not least, Norway has also been somehow an increasing participant in what we could regard as an embryonic European defence market. So in short, Norway has been associated essentially with all core aspects of the EU CFSP. Now, the diversity of this of the areas covered by the EU-Norway CFSP cooperation has also involved, and that was already hinted at by Ulf, a variety of cooperation agreements. Formal in some sectors on the basis of an international agreement, much more informal in some other sectors, taking the form of regular ad hoc meetings or telephone calls sometimes, as we know. in order to cooperate with the EU in the field of foreign affairs. So unlike indeed the other frameworks of cooperation structuring EU-Norway relations, CFSP is the subject of several types of arrangement. There's no single institutional and legal framework covering all aspects of what is covered by the EU CFSP. Rather, we have all sorts of ad hoc arrangements and flexible arrangements. Now, the positive implication of that, in a way, for Norway, is that it has preserved Norway's sovereignty in foreign security and defense policy. The counterpart to that is that Norway does not have formal channels of for exerting influence in the decision making, not even in the decision shaping in the field of CFSP, at least nothing comparable to what you find in the EEA context or the Schengen Association arrangement context. So no wonder, I mean, given that Norway has nevertheless subscribed to quite a lot of the CFSP decisions, there's been, of course, an increasing interest, but it's not new. It's perhaps renewed, but it's not a new interest in finding ways, perhaps, to be more involved in the decision shaping with respect to CFSP's activities. In the form, perhaps, of a more comprehensive, more institutional framework within which Norway could exert a little bit more influence, within which Norway could acquire more participatory rights than it actually and formally does under the present dispensation. And as Ulf said, this renewed interest is probably related to exogenous elements too. Think of the regional and global changes, if not challenges, which may have invigorated this new interest of Norway to take part more actively in the CFSP of the European Union. I'll mention three. A changing attitude of the US administration as far as transatlantic relations are concerned. That's one. Second, a much more volatile neighborhood of the not only the European Union, of Europe at large. Think of Ukraine, think of the east of the Mediterranean Sea, let alone Northern Africa. And last but not least, the third quite significant regional global change is Brexit. I'll come back to that. The United Kingdom's withdrawal from the European Union. Now, each of these developments pose new questions with respect to the whole question of security cooperation in Europe. And more specifically, as regards the role of the European Union in this particular context. Now, meanwhile, it's also been alluded to, and it's perhaps connected to this changing context, the European Union itself has shown much more appetite in engaging much more actively in the area of foreign policy, security, and defense. I'll just mention two illustrations. One is the rhetoric that has been building up at the level of EU institutions. Look at the, well, perhaps not so famous in Norway, but the recent State of the Union speeches of the President of the European Commission, and you will see that there's a great deal of interest there as regards foreign policy. The President of the European Commission suggesting that it's about time that the EU should engage more actively, also by way of using much more qualified majority voting when it comes to adopting decisions in the field of CFSP. But then more recently there was an interesting declaration from France and Germany, the Messeberg Declaration, perhaps overlooked in many corners, but being French I sort of paid attention to it. It's a Franco-German declaration of June of this year, in which security came first when it comes to the main political agenda of the Franco-German cooperation. Security came before prosperity, not only in the title of that declaration, but also in the structure of the declaration, the very first section or subsection of that declaration, out of a dozen dealing with much more technical stuff relating to the economic and monetary union, the very first section was about foreign security and defense. And in this context, the two parties committed themselves to explore new avenues to strengthen the foreign security and defense policies of the European Union. Now, one would assume that all of this may concern Norway, if not may impact on Norway. And that seems to be the case if one reads the excellent strategy that came out from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs earlier this year, if I'm not mistaken, in which I found a couple of references to Norway's interest in engaging much more actively with the European Union in the field of CFSP. I'll mention just three particular ambitions. One is to develop a political dialogue and cooperation with the EU. Second is to strengthen Norway's practical cooperation with the EU in foreign affairs. And third, to promote an engagement to promote favorable conditions for Norway's defense industry. So, and I'm coming to the report now, the analysis proposed in this report therefore assumes that there is a willingness of Norway to be more engaged with the European Union in the field of CFSP, an interest which obviously is catalyzed by the global and regional context that we have just alluded to. Indeed, the report takes account of all these evolutions, and what it really seeks to do is to examine how Norway can further its CFSP cooperation with the EU. And that brings me immediately to say a couple of words about the methodology and what really we intended to do in this report. The analysis essentially revolves around the question of what the EU is able and willing to offer with respect to that cooperation in the field of foreign affairs, security and defense, in view of the legal constraints that structure its external action in general and its cooperation in the field of foreign security and defense policies in particular. Perhaps to further explanation why this particular approach was chosen. First, while the EU is a political actor on the global stage, it's undeniable now, it is also and perhaps primarily a legal creature. It's an entity that acts on the basis of the treaties, on the basis of conferred powers, powers which the member states have attributed to the Union to fulfill certain tasks. So there are certain things you can expect from the European Union, but there are other things that you can't expect from the European Union simply because as a legal entity, it doesn't have the competence to deliver on those expectations. So it's important to establish the legal framework within which the EU is able to cooperate in the field of CFSP at a moment where the legal foundation of this competence, the Lisbon Treaty in particular, has evolved. The CFSP has quite profoundly changed over the years. It's no longer, as this report tries to show, the kind of loose framework allowing some kind of intergovernmental cooperation among the member states to try and coordinate their CFSP, their foreign security and defense policies. The CFSP is by now an EU competence which is constrained by all sorts of legal principles and which is determined by all sorts of objectives which the EU must strive to achieve on the international stage. So this legal framework is of paramount importance if we know, from a Norwegian perspective or any third state perspective, how to interact with the European Union and what to expect from it. The other basis for choosing that particular type of methodology, apart from the fact that I'm a lawyer and I'm very narrow-minded and really can't really deal with anything else but law, is that the CFSP indeed has although it is a distinct EU competence in legal and institutional terms, it's as I alluded to, it's no longer purely intergovernmental, diplomatic, and therefore flexible as it used to be. So the informality that characterizes the current arrangement between Norway and the EU might become perhaps more difficult to maintain in the future as the EU is becoming more constitutionalized, especially in the context of Brexit. The EU, as the European Council, EU institutions and member states have been reiterating throughout the Brexit negotiations, the EU is constrained by various kinds of principles, rules, obligations, which structure the way in which it is going to develop its cooperation in the field of CFSP. And indeed, this is why Brexit is so important for this discussion, because so much is being sort of put on the table by the EU and the UK because of their genuine deep interest in having a strong cooperation in the field of security. So if you like, the ingredients of the future cooperation are now on the table, and it's very important, alongside the legal framework of the EU CFSP cooperation, it is also very important to look at the ongoing discussion between the EU and the UK to try and distill some lessons which would be important for any kind of interaction with the EU in the future. So in methodological terms, this report has a strong legal component. It essentially assesses the EU's openness towards non-EU states with respect to their participation in CFSP affairs as envisaged by the law and practice of the European Union, but also paying particular attention to the ongoing discussion between the EU and the UK in their, and particularly in their ambition to establish a potentially deep security partnership. Now, I'm going to sum up what the study suggests in 4 points before venturing on the terrain of the scenarios. The first point, the first observation that comes out of the analysis is first that Norway has the possibility to join the CFSP initiatives, including, and importantly, the most recent CFSP initiatives, which the report looks into. And I'm referring here to 2 CFSP initiatives in particular, the so-called PESCO, the Permanent Structured Cooperation, which is an enhanced cooperation among some member states of the EU in the field of security and defense. The second recent initiative is the European Defence Fund. The two are somewhat connected. The European Defence Fund, which is there basically to support research in capability development in the field of defense. Now, the report shows that these 2 instruments, which are really potentially very important for the development of the CFSP and more specifically the CSDP of the Union, these 2 instruments are open for countries like Norway. If you look at the underpinning documents, first the document that launched PESCO, but also the recent document, the proposal of the European Commission that articulates the European Defence Fund, both instruments includes provisions allowing the Union to involve third states in the activities which are going to be undertaken under those 2 initiatives. We can come back to the detail of this in the discussion, if you like. Before I go on to my second observation, I should underline, and this is really one of the threads in this report, that it would appear that there's a particular openness of the EU in relation to the EEA-EFTA states compared to other third states, which will bring me to say later on that there seems to be a particular advantage for countries like Norway, integrated as they are in other fields of EU's activities. There is a particular advantageous position in having those structures to be able to have a deeper cooperation with the EU in the field of CFSP. So there is a dividend to draw from existing relations in other spheres to deepen the cooperation with the Union in the field of CFSP. And both PESCO and even more particularly the European Defence Fund seems to point in that direction. The second observation is that European states like Norway could also benefit from the ongoing Brexit-related discussions. So it's not only a hypothesis. There is something to draw from the ongoing discussion. The UK, as we know, is a very important actor in foreign policy, security and defence, and the two parties to the current negotiations, the EU on the one hand and the UK, have already indicated on several occasions during these negotiations that they have an interest in strong and deep cooperation in the field of security in general and external security, i.e. the CFSP in particular. It's been suggested, particularly on the British side, that the ongoing negotiations could lead to something quite unprecedented when it comes to a cooperation with the EU in the field of common foreign and security policy. If you look at the public documents underpinning the UK's position with respect to future cooperation in the field of CFSP, it would even appear that somehow the UK is interested in cooperating more outside the EU than as a member state of the EU when it comes to foreign security and defence policies. Now, if that dynamic was to materialize by way of indeed a strong and deep partnership in the field of security, and more particularly the CFSP, that could have a spillover effect on the ongoing discussions between other third states like Norway and the EU in order to establish a deeper and more comprehensive CFSP cooperation with the EU. But I immediately come to my third point. While this hypothesis that the ongoing EU-UK discussions could have positive effects on Norway's discussions with the EU and aspirations to deepen its relationship, the very negotiation between the EU and the UK could also have a negative impact in this respect. And that is because the withdrawal of a member state from the European Union is, as you know, unprecedented. And it has led to the EU becoming much more, it's not kind, but I would say so, dogmatic about its own principles. It's reaffirmed core principles underpinning the EU legal order, which have to do notably with the fact, first, that a non-member state cannot have similar privileges as those of a member state. That links up with another principle, which is the principle of autonomy of decision making. These principles, which are being reaffirmed, if not further articulated in the context of Brexit, could well limit the openness of the European Union towards third states in terms of allowing participatory rights, i.e. access to the decision-making setup. One of the ambitions, if I understood correctly, of Norway in this very discussion about deepening the cooperation with the EU in the field of CFSP. So this Brexit negotiations have triggered two dynamics. One is a dynamic of exploration of new avenues for cooperating with the European Union, given the clout of the United Kingdom, particularly in the field of foreign security and defence policy. But at the same time, from a more constitutional perspective, this is an existential moment for the European Union, which has led to a reaffirmation of core principles which could very well circumscribe the degree of openness of the European Union towards third countries when it comes to participation, including in the field of foreign security and defence policies. But I'm coming then to my fourth observation, which is going to somehow echo a point I have made earlier. Actually, Norway is in a different position compared to the United Kingdom, at least if we believe the noises coming out of London when it comes to the red lines of the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom, as we know, as an ex-member state, will no longer be part of the single market. It will not be part of the customs union. It wants a different kind of relationship. It wants to sever many of the links with the European Union. In other words, if that is confirmed, then the UK will have a much more distant relationship with the European Union than a country like Norway, integrated as it is in the single market through the European Economic Area, or indeed integrated in the Schengen area through the Schengen zone. And that difference of positioning in legal institutional terms, in terms of existing arrangements that Norway has with the European Union, might lead to some benefits for Norway in terms of being perhaps in a more advantageous position to claim a deeper cooperation with the European Union. Now, whether that will go all the way down to entailing more participatory rights in the decision-making of the European Union in the field of foreign security and defense policies remains to be seen. But basically, Norway could draw from the two different dynamics. One is the dynamic of Brexit, the positive dynamic of Brexit in terms of exploring new avenues of cooperation with the EU in terms of CFSP, but at the same time drawing dividend from its current positioning vis-à-vis the EU, i.e. as a participant in the single market through the EEA. And that participation in the single market has has a double nature. One is legal. Norway is simply more integrated in the single market, which means that it's easier for the supply chain to operate. And that means that for instance, the development of a European defense market, Norway would certainly be in a more advantageous position as a part of the single market than a third European state which would not be part of the single market, and where, to use the terminology of the moment, where there would not be frictionless trade between that third country and the European Union. But beyond the legal, institutional, if not practical aspect, it's also a matter of trustworthiness. When you have a country which is so much involved, so much integrated in the systems of the European Union, be that the markets, but also institutionally through the EEA institutions, the Schengen institutions, the kind of trust that is so paramountly important for the functioning of the European Union is also there, to some extent at least, in the relationship between the EU and a country like Norway because of the existing arrangement. And that is another reason why Norway would be perhaps in a more advantageous position because of this trustworthiness. And trustworthiness is a sine qua non for a potential involvement, albeit limited, in the decision-shaping structures of the European Union. The closer you are to the European Union in many other areas, the more likely you are going to get access to the decision-shaping. That's a reason why Norway cannot be somehow assimilated to the UK when it comes to the future negotiations of a CFSP cooperation. So one of the really core messages of this report is that Norway could draw a cooperation or integration dividend, if you like, from its existing links with the European Union, and in particular from its participation in the single market, both in structural legal terms and in terms of trustworthiness. Which means, and I promised I will not venture on the political terrain of giving any kind of suggestion, it basically suggests, therefore, that operating in the shadow of the UK in order to try and get a deep cooperation with the EU in the field of CFSP should be thought about twice. It may be not the most well, the strategy that one should necessarily follow, if I can put it that way. I'll make two general points before getting to my 4 scenarios. Any potential deepening of Norway's cooperation with the EU in the field of CFSP may come at a cost. It will raise several new or not so new issues for Norway, and Norway will have to grapple with these new issues. Deeper cooperation with the EU may entail additional constraints for Norway, both in terms of perhaps subscribing to some kind of dynamic arrangement, entailing dynamic and evolving obligations, potential stricter compliance mechanisms, let alone financial engagement. And all of these additional engagement for Norway will have to be pondered. Is it better to have less informalism in the relationship with the EU in the field of CFSP to preserve sovereignty and pay less, but exert less influence? Or is it better, in order to exert more influence on the, potentially, on the direction of the CFSP at the cost of more constraints, more financial contributions? Questions which have been a perennial debate in Norwegian's relations with the European Union. In other words, the kind of debate that one has had in the context of the EEA might pervade the realm of foreign policy, security and defense if Norway was indeed to engage actively to deepen its cooperation with the EU in this domain. All the more so, and that's my second general point, all the more so given that, as already alluded to, the principles which the EU is now reaffirming, if not articulating in the context of Brexit, and in particular the notion of autonomy in decision making, but also autonomy in strategic terms. The notion of strategic autonomy is becoming a core focus of the development of the CFSP in the EU. This focus on autonomy entails strict conditions for the participation of third states in EU's structures. And so that means that Norway cannot pretend to have the same access to CFSP decision making as member states. It's a truism, but one should recall that before raising too high expectations in terms of potentially acquiring participatory rights in the decision-shaping, decision-making structures of the EU in the field of CFSP. So these are the two general points to consider in thinking about the future potential cooperation with the EU in the field of CFSP, which brings me neatly to the 4 scenarios. I'll just briefly mention them. I won't go into the details of each of them, but I've noted 4, or the report point to 4 possible scenarios in the evolution of Norway's cooperation with the EU in the field of CFSP. The very first one is basically an enhancement of the current cooperation by adding to the number of structures already in existence an additional couple of sectoral structures, i.e. subscription to PESCO on a project-by-project basis, and participation in the European Defence Fund. In other words, one possible scenario is just to follow the same approach as has been followed before, namely a patchwork of sectoral arrangements, some formal, some less, by basically following the development of the EU CFSP and CSDP and connecting with those developments on an ad hoc basis. As I said, both PESCO and the EDF envisage a potential external dimension, and this external dimension seemed to be even more open towards EEA EFTA states. If you look at the EDF proposal of the European Commission, strikingly, it's by the European Commission. It's not by the usual protagonist of the common foreign and security policy or the common security and defense policy. The European Commission has a very limited role in the CFSP, and yet it's the Commission that is proposing a regulation on the EDF. That's one interesting development which points towards more intersection between the CFSP and other fields of EU's activities, which is one of the elements dealt with in the report as well. There is openness towards EEA EFTA states in the EDF, not only by way of an external dimension to this EDF, but because the proposal of the Commission is EEA relevant. Now, a lawyer knowing a thing or two about the EEA immediately thinks that, well, that's very interesting, that the European Defence Fund allocated to the support of the defense industry could have an EEA relevance. It basically means that here Norway would not be completely a third party. It would actually be integrated into the system, because if indeed it is confirmed that it is EEA relevant, the EDF document will be incorporated in the annexes of the EEA agreement, and Norway would almost be as any member state for the functioning of the EDF. So that's very interesting. Clearly an indication of openness of the EU towards EEA states, and showing quite clearly the degree to which the integration in the single market might actually bring dividend when it comes to access to new development in the field of CFSP, as paradoxical as it may sound. And that brings me to the second scenario. I have to say that when I say scenarios, I am not suggesting that these are necessarily alternative scenarios. These may be combined. The second scenario, and precisely because there is a potential EEA dimension to the development of the CFSP, is to use more extensively the structures of the EEA to try and gain more ability to discuss CFSP-related issues. It's already partly the case that the EEA Council, the sort of supreme political institution of the EEA agreement, has a role to play when it comes to political dialogue, when it comes to exchanging between the parties on big foreign policy issues. If I'm not mistaken, one of the latest points of the agenda of the EEA Council was enlargement to the Western Balkans and the political situation in the Western Balkans, as well as Brexit. So it's not only the day-to-day management of the EEA agreement that is being discussed within the EEA Council. I would think, as a lawyer, that looking at the terms underpinning the existence and functioning of this EEA Council, that there is ample scope for developing the political dialogue within the EEA Council. Plus, and I am going to make some people unhappy with what I'm going to say, I think there's much more EEA relevance in what the EU does in the field of CFSP than is already assumed. I give you an example. I have asked the question at the EFTA Secretariat and at the level of the EFTA Surveillance Authority, are the sanctions adopted by the Union, the restrictive measures, incorporated in the EEA agreement? And the answer was a bit ambiguous. There was a bit of ignorance. And I assume it's because the question has never really been raised. Now, when you look at the nature of the restrictive measures adopted by the European Union, of course there is a CFSP dimension. A restrictive measure starts with a CFSP decision by the Council, taken by unanimity in the EU. But most of the time it is then followed by a translation of these restrictive measures in trade, economic, financial terms. In other words, this connects with the functioning of the single market when it comes, for instance, to free movement of capitals, the operation of banks, etc. Now, I would consider, therefore, that restrictive measures adopted by the European Union could be incorporated in the EEA agreement. And if that were the case, then Norway should be entitled to exercise decision-shaping rights with respect to those sanctions. Now, of course, whether that would allow Norway to be involved at the level of the political decision, the CFSP decision, remains to be seen. But what I'm basically suggesting is that the notion of EEA relevance could not be disclosed or disposed of altogether because we are dealing with restrictive measures having their origin in a CFSP decision. Okay? So my second scenario is to exploit much more vigorously the existing structures and fora where Norway can exchange with the European Union. And that is the EEA structures, but you could also make connections between Schengen and security issues as well. In other words, one could imagine that Schengen could also provide another forum for, and it may already be the case, that the Schengen structures and the decision-shaping rights that Norway exercises in this structure be used also for the purpose of deepening its cooperation with the EU in the field of foreign security and defense policies. That was the second scenario. The third and fourth are perhaps more ambitious, more hypothetical. The third scenario would be basically setting up a new bilateral arrangement between Norway and the European Union alongside the EEA agreement, alongside Schengen, an arrangement whose purpose would be to deepen the cooperation in the field of CFSP and CSDP. And that framework would involve an institutional setup allowing a multi-layered arrangement whereby at the summit level, at ministerial level, and at the level of the administrations, there would be much more regular exchange between the EU and Norway. Now, this is not unprecedented. There are structures like this, both in other fields, think EEA, think Schengen, and the kind of decision-shaping rights that you find in those areas could possibly be replicated in the area of CFSP as well. There's no legal impediment to the use of that kind of structures also in the field of CFSP. Plus, there seem to be some precedent which are not completely appropriate for Norway in terms of the depth and regularity, but there is one in particular that springs to mind. That's the strategic partnership with Canada, which contains some interesting reference points when it comes to the potential institutional architecture of a bilateral cooperation agreement between the EU and a third country in areas dealing with foreign policy, security, and possibly defense. So that's the third scenario. And there are possibilities from an EU law point of view to have that kind of arrangement. As I said, it already exists, and I would imagine that it's even possible to go deeper without prejudice, of course, to the sacrosanct principle of autonomy of decision-making. The footnote is here at this point that the principle of autonomy has to be unpacked. the very fact that Norway can already exercise decision-shaping rights in other fields, Schengen, for instance, as well as in the context of the EEA, suggests that the principle of autonomy does not mean that all doors are closed when it comes to EU's institutions' openness to third state participation. So the notion of autonomy has to be understood a bit more restrictively than sometimes assumed. Now, how about the fourth scenario? Well, the fourth scenario would draw from a possible successful new arrangement between the EU and the UK. Imagine that indeed the EU and the UK are able to create an unprecedented institutional framework and cooperation arrangement in the field of CFSP, which would allow the UK to remain to some extent quite involved in various areas of EU CFSP. Think sanctions, think foreign policy, think capability development in the field of defense. Now, of course, that could be very interesting for Norway, and the question could therefore be raised as to whether Norway could actually join this kind of arrangement, which could then be turned into not so much a bilateral partnership between the EU and the UK, but a multilateral, a plurilateral, if you like, partnership between the EU and other European states in the field of foreign policy and security. An EEA for foreign policy, if you like. Although institutionally, I'm not sure the UK will be ready to accept an EEA type of arrangement in the field of foreign security and defense policy. But EEA in a sense of being multilateral and having a strong institutional and dynamic dimension. Now, these dimensions, interestingly, were mentioned by the Prime Minister of the UK when she gave her Florence speech, when it comes to the general security partnership. Now, apparently, it was essentially in the field of internal security and not so much in the field of CFSP. But who knows? It could be that there is further down the line when the negotiations will get really much more into the thick of it. It may be that the UK will be actually inclined to accept some degree of EEA-style dynamism and constraint in exchange for continued influence on the decision shaping of the EU in the field of CFSP. Now, if that were the case, Norway could possibly try and advocate the inclusion of an accession clause in this partnership so as to be able to join this kind of partnership, security partnership, not for the purpose of following what the EU and the UK would decide in London or Brussels, but for the purpose of having the same access as the UK with respect to CFSP decision shaping. Now, some papers have appeared, including some in Berlin. Some papers produced by DCAP have suggested a sort of multilateral kind of arrangement in the field of external security with the EU as a way to convince the EU that, as a way to make it easier for the EU to accept that a third state could have more access to decision shaping in the field of CFSP. So these are the four scenarios which legally could be envisaged in the light of the EU treaties, the practice that has developed based on these treaties, and considering the current negotiations between the EU and the UK, particularly with respect to a potential future partnership in the field of external security. But of course, and this is one of the difficulties with that analysis, and this was really one of the challenges in this report, particularly when it comes to, but not only when it comes to the last two scenarios. Also, the first scenario was affected by the feeling of an area which is very much in flux. We're still expecting more information as to the degree to which PESCO will be open to third states. The discussion is still ongoing among EU capitals and in Brussels. We still don't know how far the UK will manage to convince the Union to entertain a deep cooperation in the field of CFSP. So these scenarios obviously will have to be refined as things develop, but at least they might give a sense of direction for anybody working at UD willing to engage actively with Brussels to develop further relations with the EU in the field of CFSP.
Okay, excellent, Christoph. Not only the UD, also Ministry of Defense and others.
That's right. Yeah.
Now, I suggested we open up for a conversation. Arne is there in the back with the microphone. Could I just say, you mentioned it briefly, but when preparing this paper, I was also participating a bit. We met with scholars, various experts, also went and did interviews in Berlin and others to kind of explore in the ministries in Germany and elsewhere to look into kind of the legal repertoire was there. And I think it's quite interesting to listen to you approaching this from a legal perspective, because if you read the academic literature, there are basically two positions out there. Some would say, the political scientists would say, okay, UK is so important for security, so of course it's a no-brainer to create a cooperation with the EU in the field of security and defense after they leave. So basically saying, this will be done. Stop talking. And then you have these constitutional lawyers who take a completely different position. Who say, hey, this is impossible. It's very hard to kind of accommodate a non-member with these notions about autonomy and legal principles, etc. So, and what Christoph has been trying to do and done so in a convincing fashion is basically, hey, it's possible to bridge those two positions. The political scientists is arguing, hey, this is a no-brainer. And then the constitutional lawyers who say, it's not possible. And what they've done today is trying to say, create a pathway. Not only one, but four. Okay, thank you so much. Now I suggested we open the floor, and then we can also maybe also encourage some of you to reflect a bit on the political feasibility of these four scenarios, as we see it from the Norwegian domestic public opinion and political sentiments, etc. Somebody wants to join in? Back, all the way in the back.
Marian Szymakowicz, so of Poland, Deputy Head of Mission. Thank you for a very interesting presentation, as usual, in NUPI. My question concerns the NATO, because this organization has not been mentioned by you, and restriction for Norway as a member of this alliance, and how to find this balance between the engagement of Norway into EU foreign and defense policy, and to be at the same time, of course it is possible, a member of the NATO, but do you think that being a member of NATO creates some problems for the future cooperation between Norway and the EU in foreign and defense policy?
I'll be brief on this. I didn't look into that because this is more of a political issue than a legal issue. I took my task here as an exploration of how to deepen the cooperation between Norway and the EU. Now it's up to the policymakers, decision makers, to try and figure out how these scenarios may supplement, contradict Norway's position in NATO. I'll briefly mention nonetheless that Norway is not alone in being part of NATO and willing to have deeper engagement with the EU CFSP. I mean, you have a great, if not overwhelming majority of member states of the EU that are part of NATO, and I would imagine that the development of the CFSP is done in, at least to some extent, coherence and consistency with member states' obligations and participation under the NATO umbrella. So I don't see inherently any contradiction between a deepening of a relationship by a third European state with the EU in the field of CFSP and its membership in NATO. If you look at the political documents that came out of Brussels, and I'm thinking Brussels EU, not Brussels NATO here, there is indeed a willingness to strengthen the relationship between the EU and NATO. The recent global strategy of the EU for a stronger Europe is quite clear on this, and if I'm not mistaken, there are some regular connections between NATO EU and Brussels EU and Brussels NATO, including quite recently, and they seem to be more willingness to strengthen the cooperation. So this is outside my comfort zone, but instinctively I don't see any reason why there should be major tensions or contradictions between the two movements.
Thank you, Christoph, for a very interesting presentation. You said that the arrangement that Norway has today means that we participate in this area in many parts of the security and defense and also foreign policy, but that we do not have kind of access to decision making, of course, but not even the decision shaping. But it is possible, as some would argue, that we actually have some influence on decision shaping as we take part in some of the working groups when it comes to foreign policy. So I just would like you to explore a little bit on that. And when it comes to the four scenarios, could you say a little bit about which scenario you think is the most likely that Norway will develop with after Brexit in this area?
Yes, you're right. I was not suggesting that there's no way Norway can exert some influence in the field of CFSP and CSDP, and there are indeed meetings at various levels, but you don't have any formal comprehensive arrangement that you would have in other fields, whereby Norway is involved as a matter of law upstream at the very expert level meeting every time a new initiative is taken by the European Union, for instance, in the field of the single market. It would appear to me, at least I have been looking for legal evidence of some kind of an institutionalized decision shaping in the field of CFSP, and well, it's quite patchy. It depends on really the sector of CFSP and to some extent the willingness of the European Union to be open on certain dossiers. But it's true that on certain dossiers the EU has been actually quite actively cooperating with Norway, because Norway has some particular competence knowledge of certain foreign, international issues. I mean, the Middle East is one of them, but not the only one. So I'm not suggesting that all doors have been closed to Norway. What I'm suggesting is that there's nothing quite systematic whereby Norway would indeed have almost a right to be involved every time a particular area would be touched upon. And so, again, assuming that as per the strategy there is an ambition to deepen that kind of dialogue and perhaps go a little bit further, then one could try and find perhaps existing systems of decision shaping and apply them to the CFSP. I hesitated actually mentioning a fifth scenario, which is to deepen informalism, whereby you just use personal contacts and continue to be what Ulf has been writing about. Actively use your status as lobby nation to try and influence far more actively. This is an area where a lawyer feels much less at ease, as you could imagine. But good dinners, kaffekokker with officials of the External Action Service obviously play a role in exerting influence. Especially that you have a Norway house that is so centrally located. It's very easy to organize things. But obviously this is part of the deal, and this is part of the reflection, I mean, that needs to be conducted. To what extent further formalism, further institutionalization would really serve the interest of Norway in terms of, if the end goal is to exert influence, is institutionalization the best way in a particular field like foreign security and defense policy? Or is it more to use the kind of openness that the EU has shown for various reasons, because you're a good pupil in the class when it comes to implementing EU law in the context of the EEA, because you're very supportive of EU CFSP otherwise. All this kind of trust capital that has been developed over the years might actually suffice to gain access. I mean, you even have a national in the team of Michel Barnier negotiating the withdrawal agreement with the United Kingdom. Now, what other country could achieve that but Norway? So yeah, a reflection has to be carried out as to whether informalism might be the way to go. But is that what the defense industry wants in Norway? Well, not sure.
Let me just pick up on the likelihood of scenarios, because
I will get back to you
on the second scenario, the EA track. Right? I think, of course, on the one side, the EA agreement has expanded a lot. And I think as a general remark, I think it's fair to say that Norway has been quite expansive in its interpretation of what should be considered EA relevant. Iceland typically have been much more restrictive. But when it came to issues related to security and defense, I think Norway, as you said, has been so far quite conservative on mentioning this. I'd just like to mention one other legal act, or a series of potential legal acts, relates to restrictive measures on screening of foreign direct investments. Right, so it has this legal basis in the EU commercial policy and the union security that is now currently being discussed in the European Parliament. That will impact on the functioning of the single market. And I think there are good reasons to argue that some way that if this legal act is passed, it should be considered EA relevant. That's my position. But I don't think the EFTA Secretariat has even looked into the legal act to assess whether this is EA relevant as it is, because the legal basis is in areas not covered by the EA agreement. But the de facto legal kind of regulation will impact on the functioning of the single market. Now, one of the reasons why I think Norway has been restrictive on this is because we have, or shifting Norwegian governments have preferred to have a kind of bilateral relationship with the EU in these fields, not following kind of being potentially hijacked by Iceland or Liechtenstein. So I don't think that the EA scenario is, and also they have not preferred to allocate competence to the EFTA institutions either. So Norway has had this history of trying to bilateralize its relationship with the EU. So that's why I think that politically speaking, the EEA scenario is probably not very likely.
Perhaps I should specify a thing or two. I wouldn't call it the EEA scenario in the sense of using the EEA to deal with all CFSP aspects.
Use the EEA structures to discuss, you said.
Some aspect of the CFSP, not all. There obviously must be an EEA relevance, but I use the illustration of the European Defence Fund to make the point that it is already happening, that some developments taking place in the defence sector cannot be simply completely isolated from other aspects of European Union activities, and by implication from the EEA. And I haven't seen written evidence of that, but I would suspect that this is true. Norway has been quite adamant that the European Defence Fund should indeed be recognized as EEA relevant. Now, if that is the case, then that suggests that Norway has not been so conservative when it comes to defence issues. But again, what I'm saying is not necessarily all of a sudden to consider that whatever is done in the context of the CFSP, CSDP could actually sneak into the scope of application of the EEA. Obviously, no. I mean, Norway's contribution to civilian and military operations of the EU in the field of CSDP is obviously completely outside the scope of application. Even if you stretch it very hard, I mean, it's very difficult to do it that way, except perhaps when you start talking about the equipment of those guys who are going to be involved in those missions. And we see more and more interactions. This is one aspect of the report, indeed, to show the degree to which the CFSP can no longer be regarded as a sort of island in the functioning of the EU, which is somehow disconnected from the other activities, including market rules. What we see, quite the contrary, is more and more EU rules, including market rules, public procurement rules, pervading the field of CFSP, particularly defense. And that, of course, is going to have an implication on the very notion of market for the purpose of the single market, and therefore, by implication, on the scope of application of the EEA. But again, my EEA scenario is not to suggest that all aspects of the CFSP could be covered by the EEA agreement. What I'm saying is that à droit constant, as we say in good English, namely if you don't touch the law, it's possible to use the existing structures in a way that would allow you to deepen and extend this dialogue that the strategy of Norway has been referring to. And it's already there. I mean, if you look at who comes to this EEA Council meeting, on the EU side, it's definitely representative of the foreign policy apparatus as well of the European Union. And so it's possible to talk to these people also on issues of foreign policy which are of concern for Norway, especially if you can make a connection with somehow some market aspects. Definitely the European Defence Fund, again, is one example. Now, what scenario could be the most likely? I think that the first two are there up for grab.
The incremental and the EEA, or adding in the EEA, yeah.
I mean, taking part in PESCO and taking part in the EDF, and then use the EEA structures to deepen the dialogue on political affairs, including defense, that doesn't take much, in my view. Trying to negotiate a full-blown bilateral arrangement, such as the one with Canada, when it comes to foreign policy cooperation, the so-called strategic partnership, that will take years. That will take years. If you look at it legally, strangely enough, it's going to be a mixed agreement. I don't know whether you're familiar with that terminology, but a mixed agreement basically means that it's not the EU alone that is going to conclude, that is concluding this agreement with Canada. I'm not talking about CETA. I'm not talking about the economic partnership with Canada. I'm talking about the strategic partnership, which covers foreign policy cooperation, which covers fight against weapons of mass destruction, justice and home affairs, promotion of democracy and the rule of law at the global level. That's what I'm talking about. That agreement is provisionally implemented for those parts of the agreement that concern EU competence only, which means that for the rest it has to be ratified by the member states. And so it's a demanding affair, not only to negotiate that agreement with the adequate institutional framework to meet your own concern and your own interest in terms of dialogue and exchange and consultation, but you have to convince, the member states have to be convinced thereafter to ratify this arrangement. And these days, anything goes when it comes to hijacking a particular international issue for pure domestic purposes. Remember the saga of the other agreement with Canada, whose ratification was hijacked by the regional level in Belgium, Wallonia. The same could happen with a strategic partnership with Norway. Malta could hijack it for reason X, Y, Z, as Malta is hijacking ratification of several international agreements to which the EU is party, one of which is the Convention on the Council of Europe. So you could end up in this kind of long process. So is it worth it? Well, it would depend on the kind of influence you would be able then to exercise on the basis of this agreement. It may be worth it, particularly if you can include in this agreement the kind of arrangement that perhaps the UK will convince the Union to accept. The fourth one, I think it's much more politically sensitive for reasons that have been flagged up. Having a new multilateral, plurilateral security arrangement in Europe, how does that sound on the other side of the pond? And I'm not talking about the Channel, I'm talking about the Atlantic here. Perhaps it will sound good. Perhaps this is exactly what they want over there. But this reflection should take place.
I don't see any more, but I would encourage some. Over there.
Yeah, I'm not sure I need it.
I need it for the streaming.
Okay. Well, Tom Holter is my name. I'm from the Ministry of Defense, working on at least some of these issues. I'll try to be brief, and my comments are also personal nature more than anything. And thank you for some interesting reflections, which I think basically we have posed ourselves many of the same questions, including both on the sort of security policy side and those working also more intimately on exactly the defense fund. On the sort of macro level, and again, this is just a personal reflection. Brexit is very, very much sort of the big sort of elephant in the room here, and I share your basic sort of assumption about that. I guess I tend to think, or to sort of take a relatively relaxed view on the sort of the security and defense aspects of Brexit, even if we end up with a no deal. For the simple reason that I think the UK and continental Europe, EU including, and not least France, Germany, there is such a degree of, I think, mutual interdependence between the big threes in the security policy arena, and particularly these days, that I think if the UK doesn't get the sort of interaction it wants with particularly Berlin and Paris via the EU, we will see the emergence of alternative structures. And I think we already see it. Now with the European Defence Initiative, with the JEF, I think you will also see new initiatives with Germany, actually. So I tend to take a fairly relaxed view on that, actually. And that is also important for Norway, obviously in our inherent interest. I think as far as Norwegian participation is concerned, it's very much in a flux. We try to follow this, but I don't hide the fact it's difficult. And again, obviously the Brexit and the UK's future position here, it may be a determinant for us, and it's certainly an interesting question. But it may not be the only determinant, I think, for Norway, in relation to both what you know probably is the most important on the capability side, but also in terms of operations decision shaping. And I think you portrayed it correctly. I mean, obviously, if the UK ends up with a very generous, favorable agreement, obviously that would be a tempting template also for Norway. But at least to my knowledge, we certainly do not know that today. Actually, they could end up with a rather restrictive, depending also on how the broader negotiations go. So it's not necessarily in our interest to sort of to cling ourselves to the UK in these negotiations. And I think that's basically where we are today. I think Sunniva probably would like to speak on my final point, but in terms, and I'm sure she'll supplement and perhaps correct me, but in terms of, I think where our sort of hardest material interests are right in these days, it's actually the European Defence Fund. The Norwegian defense industry, correct me if I'm wrong, has rather strong interest in Europe, not just in the US. And I think it is very important for them to get some kind of interaction with the fund, and also probably PESCO, and at least not be sort of excluded because we're a third country. And I think, again, we are following this very closely now, but I think where we are exactly now, we are guarded optimists in terms of where this will end. But as you have correctly indicated, there is a price to pay, both in terms of commitments and not financially. And I think that's where perhaps the discussion goes these days. On operations, I would just add that we have a continuous sort of, or a permanent ambition to contribute with, I would say, to be fair, limited but visible contributions to EU-led operations. And we certainly, we are very well, as we speak today, of course, that contribution is very limited. There certainly is an ambition, I think, in both ministries to get higher contribution to EU-led operations. And again, decision shaping, I think the current arrangement, as you have picked it, they are suboptimal today. We appreciate what we get, but they certainly could be better. So I think that's where we are on that point. And there is also no hiding the fact that in this day and age, NATO is also obviously a NATO member. That's where sort of our hard security interests lie. We are heavily involved now, not just beyond the horizon, but not least increasingly in Europe, in the Baltics, etc. So obviously it's also a question of resources.
Excellent, thank you so much. Sunniva, would you like to supplement on the European Defence Initiative or fund?
Well, it is, as I agree with everything Tom said, and it is a challenge and it's a difficult decision, both because it involves, a lot of money. A ticket for Norway will be quite expensive. And also, by the time we need to make this decision, we won't have any experience, obviously, because we're not part of the test period or the EDIDP, only on the research side. So by the time we need to make a decision, there will be limited evidence as to where this is going and also what it will mean to Norway, or could mean to Norway.
Could I just pick up on one point and then we round off? So if you want to indicate that you want to join in. Christoph, you said that Brexit triggers kind of two dynamics, at least. One is this encouragement for exploring new opportunities. So it's kind of EU thinking, okay, we have to redefine our relationship with serious countries outside of the EU. And this cannot only be based on kind of export of a key or kind of imposing rules. Have to take up kind of face value. So there's an exploration thing. And then you said that there's also this risk that Brexit process kind of basically redefines and sharpens principles of EU decision-making on the concerns about autonomy, etc. And as you know, Norway has always benefited of having some kind of flexibility of being inside and outside. And my favorite metaphor of this is the biologist who say that with the ice rim, where you have the polar ice and the water and where these things meet, it's also always a very fertile place to be. right? Both the inside and outside at the same time. And we've been benefiting that it's been possible to position ourselves in that position. But is it so that you see that Brexit is triggering more the exploring side or more the closing side? If you understand me. And then you maybe make a remark on this as well. Because what I'm pushing for is, are we reaching a decision point where incremental, stepwise adjustments will no longer be possible? We need some kind of more proper framework in order to accommodate our economic interests and legal interest and protect our sovereignty, respect our constitution, etc.
It's an excellent question. I'm tempted to say that the timing is very important here. And what I mean by timing is that at the moment the EU is negotiating the withdrawal agreement mainly, and it wants to gain as much as possible in terms of withdrawal arrangement. Legally, the fine details of the future relationship, including in the field of foreign policy, security and defense, will be negotiated once the UK is out. So I suppose what I'm saying is that the EU has not been entirely clear and articulate as yet with respect to the terms of the future relationship with the UK in the particular sphere. We have a couple of indications on the basis of the documents that came out in the context of these negotiations, the Brexit and withdrawal negotiations, but they are pretty standard.
So PowerPoint presentations by the
That's right,
task
all
forces.
these slides. And that brings me to the other and connected point. I mean, as long as we have not entered, formally speaking, the genuine negotiation of the future arrangement with the UK as a non-member state anymore, but as a third state, we don't have the core political orientations of the European Union, simply because the current context is not the one of negotiating the future partnership. It is the one of negotiating the terms of the UK's withdrawal from the European Union. Of course, there is a dimension about the future. Article 50 talks about withdrawal negotiations taking into consideration the framework of the future relationship with the exiting state. But the framework of the future relationship is a pretty loose kind of notion. And so simply at the moment, apart from basic indications as to the kind of core principles that both frame the withdrawal and the future relationship, we don't have a very elaborate articulation of the kind of partnership the EU wants. We have a couple of red lines, but we don't know quite as yet how far the EU is willing to go. And simply the EU and the negotiator don't have this mandate at the moment. Yeah. This mandate will come later on. We have much more articulate positions coming from London, because the position of London right from the start was that, well, negotiating the terms of our withdrawal is secondary. What we want to do is to negotiate our future relationship. Well, they had to withdraw from that particular perspective because this is not what Article 50 says. But they have been continuously feeding the discussion with technical notes and papers which have to do much more with the future relationship than with the details of the withdrawal. And this is why we have this technical fish or note on, for instance, consultation and cooperation in the field of the CFSP, where the UK is extremely elaborate as to what it wants, which is basically keeping essentially what it enjoys at the moment as a member state while being outside the European Union. I mean, it's striking how this technical note basically puts the EU and the UK on equal terms for the purpose, ultimately, if everything goes well, for the purpose of adopting joint statement, joint positions, joint perhaps even sanctions, which is of course going to be extremely difficult for the EU as a matter of principle to accept.
Excellent. Okay, I see the time is running out. Let me Thank you so much for your nice presentation. Let me also pick up a final remark on what Holte said. I think he said that, okay, if it's not possible to accommodate these things within the existing structures, they create informal arrangements outside of the structures. And when we did our interviews in various capitals, also among the bigger countries, that was also clearly one of the options. But at the same time, they're very aware that if they do that, that will be the end of the idea of security cooperation within the EU. And they also have major redistribution of consequences among bigger powers and smaller powers in the EU. So I think that this issue about how to create a security cooperation in the EU, how to relate to non-members such as the UK and also Norway, is very important, not only for UK and Norway, but it's also for the future of the EU in this field. And I think that, Christoph, you made an excellent presentation, very interesting discussion, and you also alluded to some kind of giving us some pointed our attention towards what will happen after April as well. So thank you so much. Thank you, and please join me in thanking. And again, let me apologize for all the reconstruction. Hopefully when you will get back soon, end of November, it will be fancy and shiny for you. Thanks.